Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Playful Genres Leveraging Games as Opportunities for Inquiry. Our leader for this session is Josh Call, Professor of English, Grandview University. We're also joined by Sarah Olds. Sarah is one of the members of our Teacher Advisory Council who will be serving as TA for this evening. She's at Alameda Middle School in Pocatello, Idaho. So thank you for joining us, Sarah. I see you actively involved in the chat right now. And please know that we appreciate you. Josh Call is a professor of English and instructor of game design at Grandview University, where he also serves as director of the writing program. His research focuses on digital games and genres, as well as the rhetoric of violence in games and media. He has authored several articles and chapters on digital games, films, and fan cultures. He is the managing editor of the Approaches to Digital Game Studies series through Bloomsbury Press, and is the co-editor of Dungeons, Dragons, and Digital Denizens, the digital role-playing game, as well as Guns, Grenades, and Grunts, first-person shooter games. He has two co-edited volumes forthcoming in 2025, Emerging Genres, New Formations in Games and Epistemic Genres, New Formations in Digital Game Genres, both available through Bloomsbury Press. Josh, thank you for joining us this evening. To all of our teachers, I present to you our speaker. Josh, we are so excited you're here, and we look forward to your talk. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, very much for that generous introduction. Thank you to everyone at the NHC for your continued work. I'm privileged to be invited here this evening. Thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm looking forward to engaging with you. And if you'll permit me just a small indulgence, I'd like to give a shout out to my mother. I think has joined this evening and has never heard me speak professionally before, so this will be her first time as well. Make a quick slide adjustment here. There we go. I'd like to sort of set the stage for the conversation tonight and say that I'm happy to engage with questions at any point. There's a few natural breaks in this talk where I'll pause and see what questions everyone has and address them as we can, and have some time set aside at the end. But also, my social media information is included in the slides, so you are free to reach out to me on any platform. I'm happy to keep the nerdy conversations about game going. For this talk, I'm really trying to trace some intersections between related points in my research. And one of those is, sort of as the introduction suggested, a history of game genres and how genres are extensions of social and community practices. A lot of my work has been lately focused on challenging how genres have been put to problematic use, challenging sort of ethno-nationalist rhetoric and ethno-nationalist violence in games, because I think that's fairly important work to do. And I'm also convinced that at the same time, we can use genres to provide opportunities for good learning in classrooms. Games and play can be a vital tool to engaging with students, promoting student inquiry, and encouraging student self-discovery. And I think there are many opportunities where these intersect. So tonight's talk is part of my ongoing work trying to effectively map those connections and possibilities for engagement. So I've got a brief outline here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some player data, pivot to talking about genre definitions, and then talk a little bit about how we can teach through games and play. And then at the end, I'm going to sort of wrap up with two examples of games that I think model the kind of critical inquiry and engagement we can do if we're careful on how we engage students through games. So some quick player data, some demographics and rationale, if you will. This slide right here is a quick snapshot from the Entertainment Software Association's 2024 study. Now, this study in all is a fairly exhaustive document, that charts multiple data points in the industry. For example, you'll learn that the games industry is roughly a $60 billion initiative. Other interesting data includes that the sort of common cultural assumption that men are the majority of the player base is actually false. There's a fairly even gendered split across game players. There's a lot of good information about broad demographics by race, sexual orientation that really challenges a lot of our cultural assumptions. But for us, I think the most important thing is this slide showing us the sort of motivations that players identify for themselves when it comes to play. And now this charts multiple generations, so Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, Silent Generation. There are 2 points in particular where players identify that games provide mental stimulation. 77% of players report that one of their chief interests in games is that the game provides mental stimulation. Similar to that, 73% articulate that they value games for their ability to improve cognitive skills. So from the beginning, we are hearing from players that the intellectual effort or the intellectual involvement of play is one of the things that they already value. So it shouldn't be a terribly exhaustive leap to find ways to capitalize on that. So the question is, how and what? Well, this screen capture is also from the Entertainment Software Association's 2024 study, and it's just a follow-up to that previous question that explores with a little bit more granularity what it is that players value in that sort of cognitive learning space. And you can see that there's some really fantastic skills listed there. They value problem solving, teamwork and collaboration, adaptability, there's STEM-related answers, communication, conflict resolution, inclusion, and leadership skills. And if any of you in the audience are gamers yourselves or have gamers in your family or have spent any time around gamers, you can imagine or have seen ways in which these skills variously play out. If you've ever participated, say, in a massive multiplayer online role-playing game and a sort of mass party, what they call raid environment, sometimes you have 40, 50, 100 people coordinating together to achieve a particular task, very often led by 1, 2, or 3 people. Well, there's leadership skills and development, but there's also communication skills, potentially conflict resolution. If you've ever maybe had the misfortune, depending on the game session, ever heard a Call of Duty lobby, well, there are other skills that we might be interrogating, communication in particular. The point remains, though, players have identified opportunities ready at hand to do some fairly interesting inquiry work into what games can teach us, either through the process of play, in other words, the experience they're having, or the content of the game directly. And on that latter point in particular, this is where I think talking about genre, right, and just the idea of genre can be a crucial way to help students and ourselves sort of investigate and interrogate what happens when games make meaning with us and through us. And so let's talk a little bit about genre. Because on the one hand, genre is a fairly familiar term. Genre means things like science fiction, fantasy, horror. For the music fans in the room, right? You could be talking about punk rock. We could be talking about hip hop and R&B. We could be talking about folk music. Genre means, in the one sense, the kind of formal structural designs that make one thing different from another. That's a way to think about genre. But I think if we dig a little deeper, there's a bit more we can uncover about what genres mean for us. So I want to start with an idea from sociologist Sherry Turkle, who often uses the expression holding power to talk about experiences centered in digital technology. Now, this could be games narrowly, online social media, various digital platforms. But central to her idea is this notion that digital spaces stay with us intimately, attached to our consciousness, even when we're away from the device. Turkle would characterize these experiences as being vital for the development of identity work, sort of a definitional positioning to understand our human relationship between the device, what the device represents to us, and the experiences we have with it. Now, to be clear, Turkle has never used this idea in relationship to genre, but I think it's a good characterization of why genres have holding power for us. If you have ever had a conversation with someone who exists in a fandom, you know that they are very closely tied to the language of that fandom. And so genres have this holding power over us. And I think that's partially because audiences often discern their engagement habits through the repetition of access to genres. In other words, they look for future experiences that are similar to things they have already done that they value. So genres become foundational predictors of engagement with cultural products. That could be music, movies, theater, books, television, games, anything. The more familiar audiences become with a genre's given structure, the more likely they are to return to those kind of quickly accessible characteristics. You can see this on any streaming platform, right? Almost any streaming platform organizes its television or its movies, for example, of media artifacts, according to genre language. Music platforms do the same thing. We look for like characteristics. So these repeated investments kind of shape the tastes and socialization of audiences, but they also structure and permeate the discourses we belong to around these texts. So really what we're talking about is engaging in genre means engaging with intersubjective audiences and charting how they grow socially, engaging in one another with them. So this is effectively fandoms, right? We're talking about fan culture here, and we're talking about the distribution and consumption of texts in these social dynamics. And the connections between fandoms and genres are fairly well established at this point because the genre has become a vehicle for understanding the social natures of participatory cultures around any given media form. We're having a shared conversation about a TV show. We're having a shared conversation about a movie that we've all seen. That's a genre discussion. And so genre becomes a way to highlight the cultural practices of people by how they talk about objects. So if we think about that in a tiered hierarchy, what I'm trying to capture in this slide here, the first thing genres do is they organize colossal libraries into intelligent groups by their connective tissue, the things they have in common. And then beneath that, sort of like the next step down in the funnel, is that they reveal or help us recognize the social dynamics and ideologies that inform the expression and interpretation of content in that genre. And then the last thing they do is they give us a good glimpse into a foundation of or progression for the evolution of creative endeavors of like artifacts, because genres like to be similar. Oops, sorry, went one slide too far. Now, one of the crucial factors to understand this work means talking about genres as grounded in issues of politics. And by politics in this case, we mean power dynamics. James Newman in 2004 became sort of concerned about this because to think about genres as social artifacts means we have to understand them through their effects. In other words, what the genres do in the world. This echoes concerns by earlier scholars. Carolyn Miller, as early as 1984, was arguing that all genres are basically a form of social knowledge related to social exigence. In other words, what people do as a result of engaging in genres. And John Swales argued that the real task of genres is to figure out how they engage with social life and social institutional structures. So crucial to this work is the mapping of social and ideological movements. So that means the real purpose of considering genre in this way is to look at how genres and discourses are extensions of communities. They belong to the people that love them, that celebrate them, that uplift them. And that means it's about highlighting the power of people and social practice to provide or challenge the frameworks that makes genres intelligible. They are effectively operationalized through how any given society or social group codifies its acts that correspond most closely to its ideology. In other words, we will see reflected in genres what people value, what they believe, what they think. And so media expression in games and any other media form becomes an extension of how people see the world. So the formal and thematic content here is a direct reflection of how cultural moments find things valuable. Sarah Humphreys, I think, has really good language for this. She talks about genres as being very durable and entrenched, but, and I'll quote her here, genres originate from powerful stories that have shaped how we think, fantasize, and behave, and that the discourse origins and power of genres produce is not only the power of the form and its associated ideology, but the illusion of its permanence. In other words, what we see replicated in genres, we don't often critique, we treat as normative, right? These are expected, normal, everyday. So the ease with which both creators and audiences experience genre basically give us opportunity to interrogate the holding power of its associated ideas and meanings. And this is because audiences look for opportunities to identify, right? When you like participating in, whether it's film, whether it's games in particular, whether it's music, we look for things that effectively resonate with us. Kenneth Burke calls this identification, the place where we see something in the object that we're interacting with that reflects, resonates, mimics, or pings effectively values we hold, things we care about. And this is where genres become really, really essential as an analysis tool, because all genres are built on tropes, replication, reiteration, things that are familiar. Sometimes they're things that are familiar that we treat as unproblematic that we might be better served by deeply problematizing. And so if we look at the image in the slide here, right, where I've got a sort of Venn diagram, this is an example of how genres overlap, relate to one another, and we might begin to understand their relationship. So we have FPS games, right? First-person shooter games. This would be games like Call of Duty, Doom, Destiny. There's a litany of these. It's arguably one of the largest and most popular genres out there. But the definitions of that genre are usually organized by a first-person perspective and some form of weapons-based combat, typically a gun, hence the shooter in the name. Not all FPS games are also war games, although a significant number and some of the very, very popular ones are. So games like Call of Duty, right? Very much a war-themed game. So you see some potential overlap in the characteristics. Some of these are also history games, which means they are grounded in a particular place and time and narrative context that maps to something that did actually happen. Where this becomes interesting is we have ideas about each of these genres. History games carries a lot of power. The use of that word history carries a lot of significant power, and players often feel that significant power. Oh, this game is grounded in history. No, this game is a game that's using historical fiction. But that's an example of where we have to do some work helping students understand and pull apart assumptions, because the experience of play helps ground in their viewpoint a kind of epistemological resonance with the game that makes them feel as if it was all real. And please do see that understand that there is a strong sense of quotations around the use of the word real there. Now, all of this happens because games are fundamentally a constructed media. Games are not history. And trying to talk about them as if they were the same, I think, is one of the more useful approaches for humanists in this kind of work. So getting people to recognize the scope of genre, this is not entirely new work, right? Henry Jenkins has talked about what he calls convergence culture, and this is how contemporary media and platforms effectively alter the relationship between technology, markets, and audiences in ways that can functionally confuse them. And so exploring games' relationship to genre is ultimately about exploring the discourse that produces it. So genre analysis becomes, and I'm going to use some Northrop Frye language here, not so much about classifying as clarifying or illustrating the relationships that wouldn't be noticed as long as there were no context established for them. And so games become an extension of the ideological and rhetorical. They are extensions of the people that produce them. They reflect the ideas and values of the people that produce them. And those values get transmitted to players who enjoy the experience of the game. And sometimes that transmission is a bit more invisible than it should, because we have a kind of semiotic negotiation. Because games are not just read, right? It's not like reading a novel or just watching a film or listening to a song. The tactile experience of playing produces an affective and pleasurable attachment to the artifact. Players are predisposed to feel positively about what the game is and what it's doing. And so creating meaningful interventions is a useful way to pull players back from sometimes the fiction of what the genre represents. And so this image I have captured here is, I think, a really fantastic example of this. Some of you might recognize this is from Assassin's Creed 2. But this image is from a person who loved this game, loved this experience, and was deeply enamored by the Assassin's Creed franchise and its desire to be historical. And so they traveled to all the locations in Assassin's Creed 2. So on the left is the Duomo di Firenze in Florence, and on the right is the representation of that same location in the game. And the blog post that this from essentially highlights this player's experience of recognizing that while the game was very neat and very cool and, wow, very realistic looking, it ultimately wasn't the same thing as the real. And I think that's an important consideration. So that's a good pausing place in talking about genre. I think we can talk about teaching through play a little bit, but this might be a good place to see if there are questions I can clear up.
Good deal. Thank you for that. And I'll encourage all of our teachers who are here, all of our educators, if you should have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A chat. I see that there are a few that are coming up in the audience chat, so please enter them there. Josh, a question for you. We are seeing, obviously, you're part of a movement where people are beginning to understand the instructional value of using games, gamification in a classroom, particularly as a legitimate pedagogical tool. What are some of the most significant challenges you see educators facing in this shift? And do you have any strategies that you recommend to our audience for overcoming these challenges, particularly when they walk away from this webinar and they focus on implementing, more of these principles in their classroom? So what recommendations do you have for them? And if you could speak to the challenges as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic question. I think one of the most significant challenges that educators face is actually a material challenge of resources. And I think we have to just recognize at a horrible level how overwhelmingly resource challenged education is across the board. But video games they're an expensive proposition, and it's granted that the overwhelming majority of our students have some form of playable platform, but not all of them do, certainly, and not all of them have the same platform. And even if they do, games are so expensive. I teach game design regularly, and we often struggle with trying to just collectively afford text for a class. So the first thing I would encourage anyone thinking about pursuing games in education to do is do not feel obligated to be caught up in kind of the glamour of big, flashy, popular titles. There are good ways to direct students who play those games to do some work on their own. But if you're thinking about structuring classroom activities, look for free, open source games, board game opportunities. There's any number of more readily accessible things that satisfy sort of the material concerns. To talk about games, to play with games, is to just by definition be in a complicated class dynamic. So the economics of it are very difficult.
Very good. Thank you for that. I have a few more questions. A question from Alberto. Thank you, Alberto. I definitely see the benefit of video games helping students build and improve communication skills when playing multiple player games. For example, I see improvement in their writing, processing skills, the problem solve, and even the ability to adapt quickly to the use of technology. My concern is, how do we help our youth not become addicted to gaming and spending too many hours engaged in gaming? How do we use video games in our instruction as an opportunity for empowerment for our students academically and help them achieve academic growth without creating an addiction to gaming?
That is a fantastic question. I love that because I think there is a very real concern of oversaturating games. I say this not just as a game scholar, but candidly as a parent. I do try and limit the amount of time my children play because I want them doing other things. If possible, I'd actually like to return to Alberto's question during the last section, because I think what I'm going to do when I show an example of this kind of work might speak more directly in a way that'll be more clear then to how do we do this while not making it all about playing a game.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Thank you. And I'll ask this final question, then we'll move on. And all the other questions we have, we'll make time for them a little bit later, everyone. Do you see these media constructs games as more true extensions of the individual? Excuse me. Sorry about that, Jill. Do you see these media constructs games as more true extensions of the individual or high-level creativity for the sake of success, financially or to connect gamers?
The answer at an industry level is that it does all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
At a more granular level, I think we have to recognize that developers and designers, because they are people, carry multiple layers of bias, implicit and otherwise. And those biases are often reflected in the games they create. If you have been involved even tangentially lately in conversations about games, there is so much of the discourse that loves to, frankly, dog whistle the idea of, quote, woke games, and that's really just a reflection of implicit bias as it exists in the gaming community. And sometimes that is also about trying to make an argument towards an audience for financial gain. So the answer is yes to all of those. It really depends on the particular title. And so I think the question is that it's really about avoiding generalization on the media form broadly or the industry broadly, and to look at specific titles, studios, publishers, and their histories.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And again, if you also have any questions, we'll bring them to Josh's attention a little bit later, but we will move on. Thank you again.
All right. Well, this is a really good segue, I think, into talking about teaching through play. And I guess I'd like to start with some grounding assumptions, right? And I think the audience is probably going to be on board with me for this, but games can absolutely be a meaningful tool for teaching and learning. And the caveat really is that simple gamification, which is just playing for the sake of play, is not a sound way to make games useful for a learning environment. So in order to do that, what we really have to foreground is that the development or design of the game be mapped to the specific learning environment. In other words, there be a direct connection between the object we are playing and the proposed outcome of what the lesson or the course or the instructional context should be. Now, this is kind of new territory, although not exclusively, right? So game studies is a relatively new field when you compare it to, say, something like history. But despite that fact, we have a couple decades worth of data on this. And so the real virtue of teaching games as sort of an educational opportunity is what it effectively does to thinking. Writers and anthropologists like Johan Huizinga and Roger Calwa have been documenting the importance of play for social learning for some time. John Dewey offered a pretty complicated analysis of the educational benefits of play for cultivating moral habits in citizens. Recent writers like James G. have talked about games for the development of literacies, multiple literacies. And I think that's an important place to start because games have the potential to really deliver on an idea that I think Martha Nussbaum wrote about this in a 2010 editorial for the Chronicle of Higher Education that says any good education should do two things. One, it should help create a population that willingly self-informs about relevant issues. We might think of that as being an information literate society. And two, a population that's capable of understanding its thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and decisions in complex ways that attend to their implications. So really, we're talking about growing students that are active about or with reflection and meta-cognition. Games give us, or can give us when done well, good opportunities for asking specific questions. What does the game communicate to us? What do our fellow players communicate to us? What actions do players take in games, and how are those actions informed by how a game is constructed? What are the characteristics of a game and its genre, and what ideas does that foster or grow in players? These are all really good beginning points for thinking about kind of a metacognitive approach for games. And so if we think about what makes games as extensions of metacognition good for learning, it's really about how people play. If any of you in the audience are gamers or know gamers in your life, you are probably familiar with the frequency with which they jump on online platforms. They are involved in gaming news and information. They're on sites like IGN. They're on some fan-developed wiki space that tracks all the complicated data and mechanics. They are arguing over things like builds and loadouts. And there's a lot of high-level information exchange and processing that's happening when gamers do this. And I like James G's characterization of this because he calls these effectively affinity spaces, right? These are places where players come together to metagame because they share common endeavor. And the common endeavor in this case is the game. Players who are engaging in the game space, maybe not directly through play, but through inquiry, question and answer, history and discovery, tend to find that their affection for the experience is informed by their affection for the game. And so we can invite them into doing work that's game adjacent while also not just spending all their time playing on the platform, because this work is a built-in part of game culture. And what this means is that players get opportunities to do things in academic contexts that reflect what they do in games. They get to experiment, they get to speculate, they get to repeat that process, which means habituation. And they tend to like this because doing game adjacent work in this way can draw on literacies that sometimes fall outside traditional academic structures. Students often find that, it's a little rebellious, that's a little edgy, that could be fun. That is an easy, effective way to get them sort of a buy-in moment. But most importantly, what it really does is it foregrounds in the work their engagement and their value from the get-go. It's like giving them a topic they already care about, and a reason to care about it more deeply. And so if we think about that as a starting point, we create multiple possibilities, multiple pathways for habituation and engagement. It becomes about collaboration between the student and the teacher, possibly students and classmates, between the student as player and other players, or the student and the discourse broadly around the game and its genre. But no matter which approach they take in that sort of mapping, they are still doing work that requires them to think about their thinking, which means how and where their ideas and information come from. And that is metacognitive, and that is incredibly powerful because it gives us opportunities to intersect, to ask questions. We don't necessarily have to challenge, we don't necessarily have to critique. We can simply ask questions that move them further and further into a critical thinking process because of their affective attachment to the thing they're thinking about. And so that is, I think, a really profoundly important place to begin. So how we do that, I think, is probably the next step. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what it means to learn through genre as inquiry. And I'm going to give two examples here. It's always sort of a toss-up, like what kinds of games your audience will be most familiar with. So I'm going to lean on the side of two options, and hopefully I hit the mark well with this. You might recognize in the top left-hand corner, Red Dead Redemption 2. Okay, it's a very, very popular game. I'd say arguably one of the most popular games of the last decade. And to sort of articulate what this slide does, maybe some context, right? All media exists in a kind of referential chain because of the shared characteristics of the genre. So to recognize one media artifact means to recognize in part what we call media ecology, in other words, the history. So the genre history, the history of the tropes, and the history of the expression as it lives in relationship to things that were like it that came before it. All remediations, in this case, all artifacts, kind of bear the trappings of its own history. It's bound up in the message. If y'all are familiar with Marshall McLuhan, they have that really fantastic idea that the medium is the message, right? And the point of the form is to continue to imbue the genre with importance to the audience, because it should always feel new and fresh and real. That word real, while problematic, has a lot of value, right? When you look at game discourse and player discourse, when they're really involved with the game, they often talk about, oh, this feels so real or so realistic. Game design hates that word, and I think game designers probably hate that word, but players love it because it's really a way of capturing their affective attachment to it. So I want to sort of work backwards here as a way to articulate an inquiry process through history. If I have a student who tells me they love Red Dead Redemption 2 because it's like, wow, this really feels historical, or this feels like it's grounded in something real, the first thing I'm going to ask is, well, what are the things that are like Red Dead 2 that came before it? And that's the stepping stone, because, hey, if you liked Red Dead 2, you might really like these other things that came before. So what I have here is a snapshot of how that work might unfold. And to be clear, these are not the only things we might include, but it's not too large of a leap to say, hey, look at Red Dead 2. That comes out in 2018. What do you know about the movie Tombstone that came out in 1994? How are those similar? What about how Tombstone looks kind of like Lonesome Dove that, came out in 1985, a decade before that? What about going back to 1902, The Virginian? Or what about the Kit Carson stories in 1847, right? Or Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales in 1823? This is an exercise in getting students to recognize that the expressions they see now are in some ways centuries old. It's not hard to connect the dots between Red Dead 2 and Leatherstocking Tales. And if you can do that, you can help them see how ideas that started in 1823 are being continued today. Ideas about, say, the westward expansion of America, ideas about the application of violence as justice, our attitudes about racial and cultural identity as it relates to value and import. There is ready opportunity here to critique. There are abilities to talk about American cultural mythology and where American mythos comes from, good and bad. And so by doing a simple historical tropology, it's easy to chart a trajectory. And you wouldn't even have to necessarily do all of these. You could do 2 of these. You could do 3 of these. You can tailor this kind of thinking to a student's grade level, a student's ability. But to the question asked earlier, how do you get them to do work that is more than just playing games? Hey, have you read this book? This is a great book. This is a book that sets the stage for Red Dead 2. Because of this book, things like Red Dead 2 get to exist. Maybe give it a try. Maybe read this. I'm an English teacher first and foremost, and I do a lot of literacy work, and I work with students who are often very, very challenged in terms of literacy. And just to put it bluntly, I will use any tool in my toolbox to get a student to read. If I can put a book in their hand, even if they don't love it, if they just even try and read it, that's still a win from an educational standpoint. So there are many ways in which we can move them from games to other artifacts or through other artifacts, depending on the purpose of what we want to accomplish. Part of doing this work means sort of engaging in what we call a counterfactual imagination, right? And that's essentially about playing what if. This is not really new work, I guess, in some respects, right? Asking a what if question is certainly not new. Teachers have been doing this forever, really. But the what if question invites curiosity. It invites the procedural development of an idea. It also invites consideration of a chain of outcomes and events. Peter Elbow has a really fantastic essay on this. He calls it the believing game. It's sort of about testing an idea to its limits. And I think limits are important because that's a crucial element to understanding counterfactual inquiry, right? It requires that information be contextualized because that prevents the sort of identification with tropes from clouding our judgment, if you will, about what the texts mean. So like if we look at the slide here, right, the map on the bottom left is actually about Red Dead Redemption. One of the things that people often say about that game is, man, this really feels like accurate American geography. This feels like the American. You can actually see how different regions of the U.S.'s geography have been kind of lifted, if you will, and condensed in the in-game map. And things from the Midwest, the center north, the plain states, the South, all of this gets collapsed to be the image of the American Southwest. That right there is a fantastic opportunity for learning. Oh, what does this mean? What does this mean about our assumptions? What does this mean about how you think about the American Southwest? Where does that idea come from? Let's talk. We can see the same thing in these other images. This is, again, from that blog I mentioned earlier, where somebody who's deeply fascinated with Assassin's Creed 2, but basically does a walking tour of Florence, Italy, to try and map the similarities and differences between the real world space and the virtual environments that they've been navigating through this narrative. So this is one possible approach, right? This is a way of unpacking things by understanding connections. I'm going to offer another one here. Now, I hope I haven't caused anybody any emotional damage, because I have to admit, when I was putting this talk together, I saw Oregon Trail 1971. I was like, 50 years. And I had to sit with that for a second, because I remember playing this. I remember playing this in school. So if you need a moment to breathe, I totally understand, because apparently 50 years happened, and somewhere along the way I missed it. But Oregon Trail is, I think, a really good additional example. So it debuted in 1971 before sort of a broad release in 1974 by the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium. But 50 years later, we are still releasing versions of this, both the original and new versions. There have been multiple takes on the Oregon Trail in the intervening years, before even the 2021 remake by Gameloft. There's even big game fans in the room might even know the zombie apocalypse version. It's titled Oregon Trail. And if you're a big fan of zombie survival stories, I guarantee you'll love that game. But this holding power, right? 50 years, this game has been meaningful to us culturally, socially, for a variety of reasons. The Oregon Trail as a story is a sort of touchstone moment in early education. It's also the birth of several game-specific genres. We see in Oregon Trail the beginning of management sims. In some cases, these are called colony sims. You could also see the beginning of survival games in this, right? These forms focus on players in the role of trying to survive some apocalyptic event or crisis. Any number of games we could trace back to Oregon Trail. We could talk about Minecraft. We could talk about The Forest. We could talk about Subnautica, 7 Days to Die for the zombie fans in the room, right? Those are just a couple popular titles. There are many, many others. But clearly, this game and its genre have staying power, right? It's still with us. It's lingering. It's stuck to us. And I think if we want to talk about inquiry opportunities, I think the real basic question to ask here is, what's happened to reinforce the audience desire for this kind of experience? Well, it's worth remembering that genres are not exclusive to single media forms. And that is exactly what convergence culture is all about. There is sometimes a transition between creative properties across their strict formal structure into new modes of expression. So the snapshots pictured here they're a snapshot of expressive media that is thematically similar to Oregon Trail, in the same way that ideas in Oregon Trail could be linked to other media forms that predate it, novels, films, cultural mythology. And so, I mean, if you know these shows, right, some of them are still around. I think Alone is still going. I think Naked and Afraid might still be going. I don't think the other three still are. But you can trace a kind of thematic resonance through this. And here's where we have opportunity for some really interesting critical investigation. Well, what's the value in these shows, right? What are the things that these shows hold up as being good, important, useful? How does that connect to the Oregon Trail? And just candidly, you could carry this into critical scholarship. Critical scholarship on this sort of issue, right, goes back to 1941. We might talk about this as America's kind of cultural fascination with that rugged individualist myth, the idea that all Americans were sort of like somehow ready to conquer the frontier. Right there, we have ready opportunities to sort of interrogate and critique the colonialist apparatus. We could talk about post-Civil War expansion. We could talk about any number of historical, cultural, or value-based propositions that are worth interrogating. So, I mean, one of my favorite sort of examples is there's a scholar by the name of Modi Boatwright, who I think has the best name ever. He drafts a series of scholarly essays on the myth of the rugged American frontiersman. And he characterizes it as a fictional archetype often used to exploit weak-minded people to support questionable political policy practices. And he writes, and I'll quote here, "There is no more persistent myth in American history than the myth that rugged individualism is or has been the way of American life." At a statement level, that is profound because people cling to that idea because the genres that perpetuate that idea are stuck with them, the holding power of the representation, right? Centuries later, and we see that notion being expressed in these popular television shows, rewarded materially. You could chart an entire industry of success around this, the sort of mass appeal of what we contemporarily call, quote, and it's a problematic term, I have to acknowledge, quote, bushcraft culture, right? You can see extensions of industry and capitalization. All of these are opportunities to get students to think carefully about what these games mean, express, and how they are often connected to other ideas. And so ultimately, what I'm trying to argue here is that every point in any chain of relationships in and around games as media, we have opportunities to present students with the ability to ask questions as extensions of their play. And to do that means to engage with the games as a genre and how those genres have connections to other like things, which means ultimately we're asking students to make meaning of their play experience and what that means for them as a kind of individual epistemology. So I would be happy to take questions.
Okay, good deal. This is actually a question from before. It's from Eric, and you mentioned Oregon Trail, and yeah, I was one of the kids who played Oregon Trail. Again, I can't believe it's been 50 years, but this is actually a question about the games that influenced you when you were younger. I've been a lifelong gamer and have played on nearly all platforms. I believe games have helped challenge me and improve my abilities in decision making as well as entertain with various stories. What games or gaming genres inspire or shape you when you were younger? And I know you mentioned several, but if you had any others that you would like to include for Eric, I'm sure he'd appreciate it.
I love that question because that means I get to embrace my inner fan. I love role-playing games, all forms of role-playing games, because I love story. I love narrative. But even then, like that's an example to sort of talk about what I'm describing. The first stories I remember loving as a kid were knights, right? King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. Like these are the stories that my mom would read to me, and so there's a connection there. My early literacies would naturally connect me to tropes that are similar in role-playing games. So, I'm very much a product of my generation. Final Fantasy games, Dragon Warrior. You could name lots of Elder Scrolls titles. If it's a role-playing game, it's probably going to be something I have loved dearly. And I think that's part of the point here, right? It's how did we come to love these things? What does loving these things mean? And our own personal history. And sometimes that means uncovering some fairly problematic things as well, right? We can talk about representations of gender dynamic, right? Those things exist as sort of complicated issues in many of the games I've just listed. So yeah, those I have found useful. That's probably the best place to start.
Good deal, and thank you so much for that. Again, I encourage everyone, if you have questions, please enter them in the chat. And you made reference to say for instance, The Hobbit and the games that were connected to literary text. Um, what are just some ways to incorporate gamification elements to help students actively engage with material and develop those deeper understandings of historical context and perspectives? Clearly, you're now doing this work, and a lot of the work that you're doing now was informed, obviously, by your gaming as a child and your way to develop stronger research practice questions as a direct result to better understand historical text. But do you have any additional recommendations for the teachers who are here, particularly as it relates to literary texts?
The great thing about games and connecting them to text is that you can look for games that are thematically similar, right? That's sort of that generic intelligibility, if you will, right? That connective tissue. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if you want to talk about teaching the idea of the epic, or if you want to talk about teaching the idea of mythology, there are interesting ways to use any number of games that use those themes
Mm-hmm.
as a comparison point, right? The compare and contrast ability of media gives us a ready at hand framework for, in a very basic sense, doing very critical and careful analyses. So you can ask students to play games and compare them to other things that are like them as a way of understanding the difference. It's no different than, showing a Disney film and then saying, okay, what's the difference between this and the original fairy tale, right? Why
Mm.
does it feel different to play it? But and this is where different kinds of games afford you different opportunities. We could talk about board games, for example, and here's where you could look at the artistic expression around games. In other words, box art, the art that's on a game board, the art
Mm.
that's built onto game pieces as a possibility for inquiry. You could also look at the play experience as
Mm.
opportunities for inquiry. There's a fantastic game I love using with my students as a way to teach both game design but also collaboration called A Quiet Year. And it's a collaborative storytelling game. And part of the rules require that you remember and adhere to story plot points that everyone else in your session establishes. And so no one gets to claim power over anybody else. You can interpret creatively, but you can do some really fascinating things with both collaboration, expression, extrapolation. Some of you may be familiar with the board game Pandemic. We're still close enough to 2020 that might be a little too on the nose for everyone. But that is another fantastic game for teaching collaborative opportunity, discussion, and strategy making. And so the real key here is finding a game that you as an instructor can see connections to your content. Because if you can see the connection to the content, you can help your students see the connection to the content by playing it. So also, it's an invitation for instructors to be playful as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Next question. Considering the ever-changing and evolving landscape of gaming technology, how do you see that those changes and design changes affecting the future of education? Like, say, for instance, what skills and knowledge should teachers be considering now to effectively leverage the future of gaming and the new technologies that are being implemented across gaming platforms? Are there any
That is
recommendations,
a
or just your thoughts on the future of gaming in general?
I love that question because it speaks to why I think this work is frankly necessary. It is almost impossible to conceive of a future where we don't increase media literacy. All human beings are susceptible to ideological manipulation. I mean, this is not a game-specific phenomenon. This is This is Aristotle and Aristotle's ideas on rhetoric. We can be manipulated through our emotions, and visual media in all of its forms are a ready-at-hand tool for the manipulation of people through their emotions. Because if you enjoy the thing you are doing, you are positively predisposed to the thing you are engaging with. And so, I think about this with a very recent conversation I had with some of my classes, some of whom were playing the Elder Scrolls Skyrim game for the first time. I was just asking them to just tell me how they're feeling, right? Are we enjoying it? Are we not liking it? How are we feeling about this experience? And several of them commented that they thought the game was so fantastic because they finally got to see a representation of what real Vikings look like. And that's just a moment where you have to sort of stop and say, okay, let's really unpack what's happening in that sentence. Because those aren't Vikings, right? Those are images that have associations and values that can be interpreted that way. And so media literacy ultimately, right, and understanding games through genre is a way to get there, is about recognizing how we make meaning for ourselves and in society in and around texts. And so we have to ultimately look at how games as texts speak to existing ideas in culture, both good and bad. And my research is primarily focused on some of the very terrible ones, I grant you, but there are some probably good things worth uncovering too. But ultimately, I think we have a responsibility to our students and frankly to ourselves as a society to get and move people to a more critical state of engagement while also celebrating why these things can be useful.
Thank you so much, and thanks for underscoring the value of media literacy. I think that gets lost in this conversation, but thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Let's see. I think we have another question here in the chat. Acknowledging technology's role in games and gaming, do you see intellect being impacted by video games versus role playing? Like the level of intellect being called on to engage in D&D versus the skill levels in video games? Acknowledging,
that's a really, that's a really good question.
That's a good question.
Thanks, I love these questions, y'all. These are fantastic. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I think when we're talking about intellect in video games, we're talking about multi-layered things. So the levels of intellect being called on in D&D for role-playing, for example, rely on very social intelligences. I'm an avid D&D player. I've got a group that I've been playing with, gosh, we're going on a decade now. But I've always had a D&D group at one point or another. But we all bring different things to that experience. I am not a terribly good role player. I am absolutely the person who you want on your side when it's time to understand the complexities of rules. And so there's good research on this that player motivation often determines the level of focus that people bring to any given particular task. And this sort of speaks back to that point I was making earlier about meta-cognition. People love, broadly, diving into repositories of knowledge, wikis, fan spaces, lore groups. The nature of those spaces is determined by the affinities of the community in common. So if I'm somebody who's deeply attached to lore, I often find myself in the fandom or the space of fandom that's like, here's the whole history of this character that you don't find out unless you do this thing, and here's their whole backstory and why they do what they do. And you see these kinds of wiki spaces in multiple layers of fandom. For the Star Wars fans in the rooms like myself, right? The now famous Wikipedia pages that chart all the connections of different characters. That's a story-based, a narrative-based, lore-based. We might contrast that with people who really like games like Overwatch or League of Legends, where many of the spaces, not all, but many, are really grounded in the sort of technical specifics and the micromanagement of data, the plus and minuses of bonuses and skill click up times, and the language of effectively metagaming win states. And so there are different skills in almost any different game, and sometimes different skills in the same game. One of the best things we can do as instructors is try and recognize what skills our students are gravitating towards, provide opportunities for them to develop those further, while also making sure they maybe see some of those other adjacent skills that are not as natural to them. So when I teach game design, my students who are very, very into, like, I want to draw all the characters and the art and the world building, like, that's fantastic. Let's talk about some of the mechanical systems that you can make. Moving people both further into the literacies they value and maybe a little bit more adjacent to the literacies they value, I think is always a good policy, a good way to go.
Perfect. And again, Joe, thank you for that question. We appreciate that. Yeah, Josh, do you have any additional comments, or would you like another question? Do you have any closing remarks?
I think these are some fantastic questions you all are asking. I think they are highly reflective of what it means to kind of wrestle with games complexly, because if you are someone who is already predisposed to liking playing games, the connections to moving them into the classroom feel a little bit more natural. And if you're someone who maybe isn't as deeply enmeshed in sort of games in the gaming community, sometimes this feels like a thing we have to manage in our students, and that is also true. And I guess I kind of want to uplift the notion that, like, these tensions exist and are real for all of us. Like, we want to find ways to provoke and produce critical thinking and critical growth in our students, and we also need to sort of move them out of the digital world into why it's relevant and some of the sort of connective tissues outside of, just playing the game for fun. That's a struggle. That's difficult, and trying to find the right balance can sometimes be very challenging. But I think to the degree that we're all wrestling with that, those are good issues, and I commend you all for kind of doing that work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. One other question about recommendations for strengthening geography skills through gaming, geography-based games, or games to help students spatial reasoning or better understanding place. Do you have any recommendations for our teachers for any particular titles that would really help with teaching geography?
That's a great question. I think I've done similar exercises to this when I try and teach my game design students how to build geographies for worlds. And if you're particularly interested in understanding the difference between real world geography and what we might call representative geography, sort of similarly to that Red Dead Redemption 2 map example from a little while ago, Google Earth is still a really fantastic tool, because you can take game screenshots, snapshots of a place, and you can manipulate Google Earth to the point where you can see similarities, and then just the side-by-side analysis of the difference, and then a conversation about why that virtual environment feels more real in some respects to students than the real one. But even that is an opportunity just to invite them, like, well, what spaces are they interested in? If they're playing games that reference real world environments or even fantasy environments, right? You look for comparison points. If there's a castle and a moat and a dark forest in a game, well, let's do a Google Earth image and look for things that are like that and show them side by side and ask them how much the real image, it's an image, it's a representation from Google Earth, maps to their fantasy, right? What are the characteristics in common? And that alone is an opportunity to start beginning to think about those tropes that show up in genre, because sometimes the tropes have real world connections, and that's a place to pull those out.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. I appreciate that, and thank you all for your questions. Thank you for engaging tonight. Thank you for being present. And I encourage you all to review the video, to the recording here, please, there's so many takeaways that's embedded throughout. And Josh, we appreciate you for being here tonight. I look forward to continuing this conversation. And also big shout out to Josh's mom for being here tonight. You've done a fine job. And again, we look forward to continuing to work with Josh down the road, particularly with some of the in-person events that we'll be doing in the years to come. And so shout out again to all the teachers who are here. Thanks for joining tonight's session. We encourage you all to continue to follow all that's happening at the National Humanities Center. You can find all of the updated events, all of the happenings at the center at nationalhumanitiescenter.org, or you can follow us on one of our various social media channels. Certainly not a challenge, but we look forward to working with you all and continuing to connect with you all. At the conclusion of tonight's webinar, there will be a survey that you'll complete. So if there are any particular topics that you're interested in exploring in the months to come, please do not hesitate to let us know. In fact, we are building our 25-20-26 webinar series playlist, our list of sessions, which are scheduled to begin in September, roughly around September the 9th, and they'll extend well into May. So we're working on those invitations as I speak to you all. So if there are any particular topics, scholars who you are interested in hearing from, please do not hesitate to reach out to me at mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Of course, we are looking forward to another transformative season. Support the humanities education programs. I encourage you all to do so. NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools they and their students need to make a difference. As I said in my opening comments, we are a private nonprofit institution. So any gift, any purchase from our online store, we would greatly appreciate that. So we will be back. We have a little bit of a break, but we will be back April 8th. Country Soul, Music and Race in the American South with Charles Hughes. He's an associate professor of history and urban studies out at Rhodes College. I look forward to that session. I'm an avid music fan, as you all can tell from the playlist that I carefully curate for each session. Again, we appreciate you all. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to close out here, and I hope you all have a productive week. If I can help out in any way, please do not hesitate to reach out. We're going to close out with a minute and 20-second long Legend of Zelda theme song. Have a good night and take care.